But once I got knee deep into it, I just had to keep going. So I don't know if I accomplished simplifying, but I drew it. I took the time, so I'm going to present it to you. It just summarizes, I guess I talked a lot about this already, but let me highlight a few things to specifically point to how this affects educational diaspora. With U.S. colonization that set in motion migration, you see on the left side of the figure, moving to the right, the three main forms of migration that were set in motion that I'm referring to here, I'm highlighting here: labor migration, military migration, and social mobility and migration. And it is this diasporic response to these channeled colonial migration patterns that is on the right side of the figure that I'm referring to. And the educational diaspora is simply among the forms of diaspora that overlap with the cultural, the familial, the healthcare diaspora, etc. And so it's the bottom right-hand corner, which is what I mostly want to talk to you about tonight. And the reason why I'm interested in this topic, not only for obvious personal reasons, but in my own observation, my own anecdotal observation, there seems to be a stirring of a new generation of Chamorro students and activists that are moving the questions that were asked in the 90s and the questions that were asked in the 70s to another level. And the level of work and enthusiasm is something that's obvious to me in their work. So this new generation of Chamorro students, I think, are really at the bedrock of appropriating higher education in ways to serve our people and our island in a global context. Another related topic to this educational diaspora has to do with ongoing pan-ethnic formations that Chamorros are tapping into in their coalition building with other critically minded minority students on the U.S. mainland and in Hawaii. And then finally, it is within that context that I think Chamorro indigeneity and claims for sovereignty are articulated in very sophisticated and articulate ways. As a brief overview, I know I'm throwing around a lot of terms. I'm a professor, it comes with the territory, so there's a lot of big words. But I'm always interested in making sure that we're not just using big words to sound smart, right? There's a lot of big words. We go through education and you pick up the language. But I've always been critical of professors that simply want to use the words but are saying nothing, or at least I don't understand what they're saying. So I wanted to clarify the key concepts here in addition to diaspora, which has to do with sovereignty and indigeneity. And these are terms, they're big words and they're political words, they're academic words. But the reason why I think that what I'm doing is beyond just using big words is because these are the words that have been appropriated by Native people. And they mean something not in just the abstract, not just in a lecture hall of interested academic people, but they mean something legally, they mean something politically, they mean something spiritually, they mean something essentially to who people are. And so again, it's an appropriation because Native people didn't invent the term indigenous. They didn't invent the term Native. We didn't invent the term Chamorro, regardless of the spelling. And so what does it mean to say that, well, that term implies that you're indigenous, and that term implies that you're assimilated, or that you're a sellout, or whatever, coconut, or whatever term of the day is. But these are real terms that are real not because of who invented them, but who appropriated them from where I'm standing. And so when we look at sovereignty, this kind of authority and legitimacy over one's rights, in the U.S. context, there's been a limit to the way indigenous people can articulate their sovereignty. First and foremost, it's within the U.S. federal government. Secondly, sovereignty is understood in terms of state sovereignty, and hence the prospects for statehood for places like Puerto Rico and Guam. And then finally, in terms of Native American experiences, over 500 nations of Native Americans, there is the legitimate recognition of tribal sovereignty that was created by the U.S. federal government. So all of these sovereignties weren't created by indigenous people. And these aren't all of them. These are just the main ones in a U.S. context. In terms of Chamorro sovereignty, as I've read in the works, especially my academic elders from the 60s and the 70s, has to do with the Chamorro movement and has to do with the articulations in the Organic Act of Guam, of the recognition that you do have an indigenous people that have a unique relationship to the land. And so it is out of that understanding, which again was externally imposed, which was authored by someone else from the outside, has been the basis, the legal and political basis of the Chamorro movement towards self-determination and indigenous sovereignty. And then finally, and more recently in 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was finally accepted. So that is another more global basis in which sovereignty, Chamorro sovereignty and other indigenous sovereignties, have an opportunity to articulate themselves and further legitimate their claims. So that's just the overview. Now what I'm, mainly what I'm interested at this point in my own analysis of these issues is the role of higher education in a so-called, political academic sovereignty. And what I'm referring to here is what makes your story legitimate? What makes your story legit? Okay? If you tell me a story about what happened last week, and someone else tells me a story of the same moment, and you have two very different stories, who should I believe? You see? And it has to do with who has more power. It doesn't necessarily mean who's more truthful. It has to do with who is the better storyteller. Okay? And so it's the power and the who's the better part that, there's kind of a delicate balance between the two. Historically, because we did not invent sovereignty, in fact, the U.S. didn't invent the term. It had to do with power. So there's a limitation on an indigenous people's ability to articulate who they are and their entitlements by using the language of somebody that didn't intend to empower you. So it's the other part of sovereignty. It's how well can I tell my story? And it's from that storytelling that is native that has to do with legitimacy. Higher education, academia, the academy, I think, again, this is speculative. This is early steps in my ideas on this stage of the analysis. But there's something about higher education that legitimizes our stories when it's appropriated and enables indigenous people to kind of voice their own stories within that venue. And that itself connects and legitimizes things like indigenous sovereignty, Chamorro sovereignty, legally and politically within the U.S. And so in the academic world, what we do as professors, we don't just go to class and then go back to the office and have coffee and go to class. We do a lot of different things, as you know. And one of the things we do is we write. And a lot of us like to think we write for people to listen. That may not be the truth because we publish in these journals and sometimes they just collect dust in libraries. Nonetheless, I think a lot of us write with the spirit of being heard. And so this new generation of Chamorro students, I think, are tapping into that opportunity to articulate themselves through their rigorous study and analysis, among other students, to articulate themselves and to be heard. And I think that's in part what's going on. And so among the academic fields that I think this is taking place are in fields like ethnic studies, American studies,